March 2nd, 1943, 0730 hours. Aboard the transport Kyokusei Maru, Bismarck Sea. Commander Suguru Suzuki stood on the bridge wing, binoculars scanning the horizon with practiced ease. Around his ship, 7 other transports moved in precise formation, each carrying between 800 and 900 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army's 51st Division. Surrounding them, 8 destroyers cut through the morning swells, their anti-aircraft guns pointed skyward, ready for the Allied bombers that would inevitably come. Suzuki had made this run before. He understood the mathematics of convoy protection. The Americans would attack from high altitude, as they always did. His destroyers would lay down curtains of flak. Some bombs would fall close, perhaps damage a ship or two, but the convoy would reach Leh. They always reached Leh. What Commander Suzuki didn't know, what no Japanese naval officer could have conceived, was that 15 miles away, 18 B-25 Mitchell bombers were descending to wave-top height, their bomb bay doors already open, preparing to introduce the Imperial Japanese Navy to a form of warfare that would make high-altitude bombing obsolete and turn his heavily defended convoy into a massacre that would last exactly 15 minutes. Within the next quarter hour, all 8 transport ships carrying 6,900 soldiers would be sinking or in flames. Within 90 minutes, the Bismarck Sea would be littered with wreckage and bodies. Within 24 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy would be forced to confront a terrifying truth. The Americans had developed a technique against which there was no defense, and every convoy route in the Southwest Pacific had become a killing ground. The story of how 18 modified bombers destroyed an entire convoy in less time than it takes to eat lunch would force Japan to abandon surface reinforcement of New Guinea entirely, strand hundreds of thousands of troops without supply, and prove that American innovation could turn adequate aircraft into weapons of unprecedented lethality. But that morning, as the sun climbed over the Bismarck Sea, Commander Suzuki sipped his tea and reviewed his charts, confident in the protection of his destroyer screen. He had 11 minutes left to live. The Japanese convoy that departed Rabaul on the evening of March 1st, 1943, represented the Imperial Japanese Navy's most sophisticated approach to the eternal problem of moving troops through contested waters. Operation 81, as it was designated, embodied decades of Japanese naval doctrine refined through bitter experience in the Solomon Islands campaign. The convoy consisted of 8 transport vessels: Kyokusei Maru, Teiyo Maru, Nojima, Aiyo Maru, Kembu Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, and the largest, the 10,000-ton Kyokuyo Maru. Together, they carried 6,900 troops of the 51st Division's 115th Infantry Regiment, along with supplies, ammunition, and equipment essential for the defense of Leh against the advancing Allies. But the transports were merely the cargo. The real strength of Operation 81 lay in its escort, 8 destroyers of the Imperial Japanese Navy's finest: Shirayuki, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asagumo, Arashio, Asashio, Shikinami, and Uranami. These vessels, each mounting between 6 and 8 5-inch guns plus numerous anti-aircraft weapons, formed a defensive screen that Japanese planners believed made the convoy effectively impregnable to air attack. The tactical doctrine was sound, proven through 2 years of warfare. American heavy bombers attacking from 12 to 15,000 feet faced a wall of flak from the destroyers' coordinated fire. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, while devastating against undefended targets, achieved hit rates of less than 2% against moving ships defended by concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Japanese naval intelligence had calculated the probabilities exhaustively. In 37 previous convoy operations from Rabaul to Leh during 1942 and early 1943, Allied air attacks had sunk exactly 4 transport vessels. 17% losses were acceptable in modern warfare. More importantly, every previous attack had followed the same pattern: high altitude level bombing, easily predictable, relatively ineffective. Admiral Masatomi Kimura, commanding the destroyer escort, had fought the Americans since Pearl Harbor. His operations order for March 1st laid out defensive procedures refined through experience: maintain formation integrity, coordinate anti-aircraft fire, use destroyer speed to keep station around the slower transports, which moved at just 7 knots. What the operations order didn't address, what no Japanese planning document had ever considered, was the possibility of bombers attacking from masthead height at 300 miles per hour, releasing bombs that would skip across the water like flat stones, strike ships below the waterline where armor was minimal, and detonate inside the hull with catastrophic effect. The Americans had been working on that problem for 8 months. Major Paul Irving Gunn was 52 years old in 1943, ancient by combat aviator standards, but his 4 decades of experience with machinery, engines, and aircraft had made him perhaps the most innovative aviation tactician in the Southwest Pacific. A former Navy pilot and Philippines-based airline executive, Gunn had escaped to Australia in early 1942 and immediately offered his services to General George Kenney's 5th Air Force. Kenney, himself an innovator who valued results over regulations, recognized Gunn's genius immediately. When Gunn proposed modifying B-25 Mitchell bombers to carry 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns in the nose, Kenney gave him free rein. When Gunn suggested experimenting with low-level bombing techniques that violated every doctrine in the training manual, Kenney provided the aircraft and ammunition. The skip bombing technique that emerged from these experiments was devastatingly simple in concept, extraordinarily difficult in execution. A bomber would approach its target at extremely low altitude, 50 to 100 feet above the water, at maximum speed. At a precisely calculated distance, typically between 200 and 400 yards, the pilot would release a 1,000-pound bomb with a delayed fuse. The bomb would strike the water, skip like a stone across the surface, and slam into the ship's hull at or below the waterline. 5 to 7 seconds later, after the bomb had penetrated the hull and settled inside the ship, the fuse would detonate. The advantages were overwhelming. Ships' anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress low enough to engage aircraft at masthead height. The delayed fuse meant bombs exploded inside the target rather than against armored exteriors. The low altitude made the bomber nearly impossible to track and engage before it was already past the target. Most importantly, accuracy at point-blank range exceeded 90%, compared to the 2% achieved by high-altitude bombers. But the technique required extraordinary piloting skill, nerves that could maintain course toward a heavily armed warship at wave-top height, and precise timing of bomb release. Miss the calculation by even half a second, and the bomb would skip over the target or detonate prematurely. Hesitate or flinch, and concentrated Japanese gunfire would tear the bomber apart. Most difficult of all was the psychological challenge of maintaining straight and level flight directly toward ships whose every gun was firing at point-blank range. Throughout late 1942 and early 1943, Gunn and a handful of volunteer crews practiced relentlessly. They dropped hundreds of practice bombs against target vessels in Townsville Harbor. They refined approach angles, calculated optimal release points for different ship sizes, and developed standardized attack patterns. Most importantly, they armed the B-25's nose with additional machine guns, turning each bomber into a flying battleship that could suppress anti-aircraft fire during the attack run. The modified B-25s, nicknamed commerce destroyers by their crews, carried 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns mounted in the nose by squadron armorers, 4 more 50s in blisters on each side of the forward fuselage, plus the standard dorsal turret and waist guns. Total forward firepower: 8 50-caliber machine guns capable of firing 3,200 rounds per minute. This modification served dual purposes. First, the concentrated fire suppressed anti-aircraft crews, forcing them to seek cover rather than man their weapons. Second, and perhaps more psychologically important, the roar of 8 machine guns gave pilots something to do besides fly straight into enemy fire. The act of shooting back, even if not always effective, steadied nerves during the 30-second eternity of the attack run. By late February 1943, the 91st Bombardment Squadron, nicknamed the Jolly Rogers, had become the 5th Air Force's skip bombing specialists. Their commander, Major Ed Larner, had personally conducted 63 practice attacks and 17 combat missions using the technique. His pilots had developed such precision that they regularly placed practice bombs within 10 feet of target points. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, recognized skip bombing's potential to revolutionize anti-shipping warfare in the Southwest Pacific. In a February 20th memo to General Douglas MacArthur, he wrote, "We have developed a technique that will make Japanese convoy operations untenable. When we find the next major convoy, we will destroy it completely." MacArthur, skeptical but desperate for a decisive victory after months of grinding attrition in New Guinea, authorized Kenney to demonstrate your technique against a suitable target. Operation 81 would be that demonstration. Japanese intelligence had detected Allied reconnaissance flights over Rabaul on February 28th and March 1st. They knew the Americans were aware of the convoy's departure. Japanese planners expected the attacks to begin once the convoy entered range of Allied airfields in Papua, approximately March 2nd or 3rd. What they anticipated was the standard pattern: high-altitude bombing by B-17 and B-24s, fighter sweeps by P-38 Lightnings, perhaps some medium-level attacks by B-25s operating conventionally. The defensive plan emphasized concentrated anti-aircraft fire and evasive maneuvering. The destroyers would create overlapping fields of fire, making high-altitude bombing ineffective. Fighter cover from Rabaul-based Zeros would handle any Allied fighters that penetrated to the convoy. Admiral Kimura's operations order stated confidently, "The enemy will attack with high-altitude bombers as they have in all previous operations. Our anti-aircraft defenses are adequate to prevent significant damage. The convoy will arrive at Leh on March 4th with acceptable losses." The night of March 1st to 2nd passed uneventfully. The convoy made good time in calm seas, the destroyers maintaining their protective screen. Aboard the transports, soldiers of the 51st Division tried to sleep in the crowded holds, most experiencing their first ocean voyage, many already seasick in the tropical heat. Dawn on March 2nd revealed clear skies and good visibility, conditions that favored attackers but gave defenders maximum warning time. At 0730 hours, as Commander Suzuki sipped his morning tea, a lookout on the destroyer Shirayuki spotted aircraft approaching from the south. The initial contact was 21 B-17 Flying Fortresses of the 63rd and 65th Bombardment Squadrons approaching at 14,000 feet, exactly as Japanese doctrine predicted. Kimura ordered the convoy to maintain course, destroyers to prepare for anti-aircraft action. This was the attack they had trained for, the attack they expected. At 0753 hours, the B-17s began their bombing runs. Destroyers opened fire, creating black flowers of flak at altitude. The transport's own anti-aircraft guns joined the barrage. Aboard Kyokusei Maru, Suzuki watched with satisfaction as bombs fell wide, most missing by hundreds of yards. One B-17 took hits and peeled away, trailing smoke. The convoy maintained formation. The high-altitude attack lasted 12 minutes and accomplished exactly what it was designed to accomplish: fix Japanese attention upward while positioning the convoy for the killing blow. As the last B-17 pulled away and Japanese gunners congratulated themselves on their gunnery, 18 B-25 Mitchells of the 91st Bombardment Squadron were descending to Wavetop Height, 60 miles south of the convoy. Major Ed Larner, leading the formation in his B-25 named Blonde Bomber, checked his position. His 18 aircraft flew in 3 flights of 6, spread across a 3-mile front. At 50 feet above the water, they were below Japanese radar coverage. At 300 miles per hour, they would cover the final 20 miles in 4 minutes. At 0810 hours, lookouts on the destroyer Asagumo spotted the B-25s. At first, they appeared to be flying into the water, their altitude so low that spray kicked up behind them. The destroyer's anti-aircraft guns began to traverse downward, but the mechanisms weren't designed for such extreme angles. Most couldn't depress below 20 degrees. The B-25s were coming in at 5 degrees above the horizon. Aboard Kyokusei Maru, Suzuki watched in confusion as the bombers approached. This wasn't high-altitude bombing. This wasn't medium-level attack. The aircraft were flying so low they seemed to be skimming the waves. What were the Americans doing? At 0812 hours, he found out, the first flight of B-25s, led by Lana himself, opened fire at 800 yards. 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns per aircraft, 6 aircraft in the flight, 288 rounds per second combined, tracers making solid streams of light. The target was the destroyer Tokitsukaze, positioned at the convoy's southern edge. Japanese anti-aircraft crews on the destroyer's deck watched in horror as a wall of lead advanced toward them at 300 miles per hour. The destroyer's captain ordered evasive action, but at 7 knots convoy speed, his ship might as well have been anchored. The machine gun fire hit first, walking across the deck, shredding exposed crewmen, destroying gun mounts, creating chaos. 3 seconds later, the first B-25 released its bomb at 300 yards. The 1,000-pound weapon struck the water with a tremendous splash, skipped once, twice, and slammed into Tokitsukaze's hull just forward of the bridge. The aircraft roared overhead, so low that its prop wash created visible disturbance on the water. 5 B-25s followed at 3-second intervals. 5 more bombs skipped across the water. 4 more hit the destroyer, 1 below the waterline amidships, 1 just aft of the stern, 1 near the bow, 1 at the waterline near the engine room. The delayed fuses functioned perfectly. The first bomb detonated 7 seconds after impact deep inside the destroyer's hull. The explosion created a pressure wave that ruptured bulkheads, started fires, and killed everyone in the forward section. The second bomb exploded in the engine room, destroying both boilers and opening the hull to the sea. The remaining 3 bombs detonated in sequence, each adding to the catastrophic damage. At 0813 hours, 60 seconds after the first B-25 opened fire, Tokitsukaze was dead in the water, listing heavily to port, fires raging, her back broken by internal explosions. She would sink in 11 minutes. But the first flight of B-25s had already moved to their secondary targets. 3 aircraft attacked the transport Kyokusei Maru, the convoy's largest ship. 3 attacked Shinai Maru. At point-blank range, with pilots who had practiced this specific attack pattern for months, the results were devastating. Kyokusei Maru took 2 skip bomb hits below the waterline. The explosions opened her hull like a can opener, creating breaches too large for damage control to address. Seawater flooded the lower holds at catastrophic rates. Soldiers sleeping in those holds died without warning, as water rushed in with the force of a tidal wave. Shinai Maru took 1 hit near the stern that destroyed her rudder and propeller, leaving her dead in the water and unable to maneuver. A second bomb hit amidships, penetrating into a hold packed with ammunition. The resulting secondary explosion was visible from 40 miles away. Shinai Maru simply disintegrated, her back broken, her hull torn in half. She sank in less than 3 minutes, taking 700 soldiers down with her. The second and third flights of B-25s attacked in sequence, targeting the remaining transports with methodical precision. Each pilot had studied recognition photographs, knew which transport he would attack, had calculated the exact release point for his specific target. Kyokusei Maru, Commander Suzuki's ship, took 3 hits in rapid succession. The first bomb exploded near the bow, opening a breach 15 feet wide. The second detonated in the engine room, destroying the propulsion system and killing everyone there instantly. The third hit aft near the steering gear. Suzuki, thrown to the deck by the first explosion, struggled to his feet and immediately understood the situation. His ship was mortally wounded. The massive hull breach forward meant she would sink by the bow within minutes. He ordered abandon ship, but the words were unnecessary. Soldiers were already pouring onto the deck, many without life preservers, panicked by the explosions and the rapid listing. The entire attack from the first machine gun burst to the last bomb release lasted 9 minutes. At 0821 hours, the 90th Bombardment Squadron's 18 B-25s reformed and headed south, their bomb bays empty, their machine gun barrels hot. Behind them, the Bismarck Sea was a scene from hell. All 8 transport ships were sinking or in flames. Kyokuyo Maru had capsized and sunk 3 minutes after being hit. Shinai Maru was already gone, leaving only a spreading oil slick and floating debris. The remaining 6 transports were in various stages of death, all listing heavily, all with fires raging, all visibly settling in the water. The destroyer Tokitsukaze had sunk at 0824 hours. 3 other destroyers, Asagumo, Yukikaze, and Shikinami, had been damaged by near misses or machine gun fire, though they remained operational. The undamaged destroyers were attempting to rescue survivors, a mission complicated by continuing Allied attacks. Throughout the afternoon of March 2nd, additional waves of Allied aircraft arrived. B-17S bombed from altitude. Australian Beaufighters strafed survivors in the water, a controversial action that would generate significant post-war debate. PT boats from Morobe moved in to attack damaged vessels. By nightfall, all 8 transports had sunk. 4 destroyers had been sunk or damaged beyond repair. Of the 6,900 Japanese soldiers aboard the transports, approximately 3,000 died in the initial attack or in the water afterward. Of the survivors pulled from the sea, many were wounded, burned, or suffering from oil ingestion. The 51st Division's 115th Infantry Regiment ceased to exist as a combat-effective unit before it ever reached land. In 15 minutes of combat, skip-bombing B-25s had achieved what months of high-altitude bombing had failed to accomplish: the complete destruction of a heavily defended Japanese convoy. The mathematics were irrefutable. 18 bombers had destroyed 8 transports and damaged or sunk 4 destroyers. The kill ratio was unprecedented in anti-shipping operations, but the statistics, impressive as they were, didn't capture the psychological impact on survivors. For soldiers who had endured the terror of bombs exploding inside their ship, the rapid flooding, the fires, the oil-covered water filled with sharks and debris, the experience shattered faith in Japanese naval protection. For destroyer crews who had watched helplessly as bombers flew below their guns' depression angles and destroyed ships one by one, the attack revealed a vulnerability against which they had no counter. And for Commander Suzuki, floating in the oil-covered water among the wreckage of his ship, watching hundreds of soldiers drown around him, the realization was complete and devastating. The Americans had developed something against which Japanese doctrine had no answer. The convoy system that was supposed to make reinforcement possible had been rendered obsolete in a quarter of an hour. The destroyers Yukikaze and Uranami managed to rescue some survivors before withdrawing toward Rabaul that evening. Suzuki was among them, pulled from the water after 3 hours, covered in oil, his uniform burned, his command destroyed. As he stood on Yukikaze's deck, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, he looked back at the Bismarck Sea. The water was covered with debris for miles. Life rafts, lumber, bodies, equipment floated in enormous oil slicks. Smoke from the last burning transport rose thousands of feet into the afternoon sky. The sea was dark with oil and blood. In his 16 years of naval service, Suzuki had seen combat in China, witnessed the Pearl Harbor attack, survived surface actions in the Philippines. Nothing had prepared him for this. Not the speed of the destruction, not the helplessness of ships unable to defend themselves, not the screams of soldiers trapped below decks as water rushed in. That night, aboard Yukikaze, as the destroyer fled north toward Rabaul, Suzuki wrote in his diary, "The Americans have discovered a form of warfare against which we are defenseless. Our ships cannot protect themselves. Our soldiers cannot reach their destination. The sea itself has become our enemy, used as a weapon by pilots who fly so low they touch the waves. We are not fighting an enemy with better ships or more courage. We are fighting an enemy who has revolutionized naval warfare while we clung to doctrine that became obsolete this morning. The entry ended with a question that would haunt Japanese naval planning for the rest of the war. How do we fight this? The destroyer Yukikaze arrived at Rabaul Harbor on March 3, 1943, carrying the remnants of Operation 81. Of the 6,900 soldiers who departed 2 days earlier, fewer than 1,400 returned. Most were injured, burned, or traumatized. The 51st Division's combat strength had been reduced by 78% before firing a single weapon. Admiral Masatomi Kimura's after-action report, discovered in Japanese archives after the war, revealed the complete psychological impact. "The American attack employed a technique we have never encountered," Kimura wrote. "Bombers approached at extremely low altitude. Our anti-aircraft weapons could not depress sufficiently to engage them. They released bombs that struck the water and skipped into our ships below the waterline, exploding inside the hulls with devastating effect. 8 transport vessels were destroyed in approximately 15 minutes. I must report that we have no defensive capability against this form of warfare. If the enemy employs this technique regularly, convoy operations cannot continue." Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's response was remarkably prescient. "If the Americans can destroy entire convoys in minutes using this method, our ability to reinforce isolated garrisons is finished. We cannot replace losses at the rate they can inflict them. This single tactical innovation may decide the outcome in the Southwest Pacific." Yamamoto ordered immediate investigation into countermeasures. Every analysis reached the same conclusion: there was no effective defense with existing equipment and tactics. The fundamental problem was physics. Ships' anti-aircraft guns were designed to engage aircraft at medium to high altitude. Japanese destroyer guns could elevate to 85 degrees, but only depress to -10 degrees. A bomber at 50 feet altitude approaching at 300 miles per hour couldn't be engaged until it was past the ship. Some Japanese officers suggested fighter escorts could prevent attacks, but fighters based at Rabaul had limited range and couldn't provide continuous coverage. Moreover, P-38 Lightnings escorting the B-25s were proving superior to Zero fighters. Other proposals included equipping transports with additional anti-aircraft guns, adding bow armor, and night convoy operations. Each idea founded on practical limitations. Additional guns required crews Japan didn't have. Armor reduced cargo capacity. Night operations simply delayed the inevitable attack to dawn. Meanwhile, General George Kenney was rapidly expanding skip bombing operations. The spectacular success at Bismarck Sea validated his doctrine of low-level attack. Within weeks, the 5th Air Force had converted 4 additional B-25 squadrons to the skip bombing role and modified 24 A-20 Havocs for similar tactics against smaller vessels. The technique that had emerged from Major Paul Gunn's workshops in Townsville became standard training for all medium bomber crews in the Southwest Pacific. By April 1943, newly arriving bomber crews spent their first week practicing skip bombing before being declared combat ready. The 5th Air Force had discovered a weapon that rendered Japanese convoy operations suicidal, and they intended to exploit it ruthlessly. To understand the revolution skip bombing represented, one must appreciate the frustration that preceded its development. Throughout 1942, Allied aircraft attacked Japanese shipping with depressing ineffectiveness. High-altitude bombing achieved hit rates between 1% and 3% against moving ships. The problem was mathematics. A bomb dropped from 12,000 feet took 30 seconds to reach the water. In 30 seconds, a ship moving at 10 knots traveled 500 feet. The bombardier had to calculate speed, heading, and probable evasive maneuvers, aiming at empty ocean where the ship would be 30 seconds in the future. Japanese captains understood this. Standard procedure was to watch for bomb release, count to 10, then order hard rudder turn. The bombs would fall where the ship had been. Against coordinated evasive maneuvers, high-altitude bombing effectiveness dropped below 1%. Major Paul Gunn had watched these futile attacks with growing frustration throughout mid-1942. The former Philippines-based pilot had a mechanic's instinct for practical solutions. If bombs couldn't hit ships from altitude, he reasoned, get closer. If getting closer meant flying into anti-aircraft fire, suppress that fire with forward-firing guns. If forward-firing guns weren't standard on bombers, install them. The first experimental installation took place in July 1942 at Eagle Farm Airport near Brisbane. Guns team removed the bombardier position from a B-25C and installed 450 caliber machine guns in the nose. Additional guns were mounted in blisters on the forward fuselage. The result was 8 forward-firing machine guns plus existing dorsal turret and waist guns. Test flights revealed unexpected benefits. Concentrated forward firepower suppressed light anti-aircraft positions. Tracers provided visual feedback for aiming. The psychological effect of firing back helped pilots maintain steady course. General Kenny ordered immediate conversion of all available B-25s to the Commerce Destroyer configuration, but installing guns was only half the solution. The skip bombing technique itself required development through trial, error, and mathematical calculation. Through August and September 1942, volunteer crews practiced against target ships in Townsville Harbor. They discovered that bomb release altitude, speed, and distance from target had to be precisely calculated for each weapon type and target size. A 1,000-pound bomb with a delayed fuse, released from 50 feet at 300 miles per hour and 250 yards from target, would skip once or twice before striking the ship's hull at or below the waterline. The delayed fuse, typically set for 5 to 7 seconds, allowed the bomb to penetrate the hull and settle inside before detonating. This internal explosion caused catastrophic damage that external hits couldn't match. The pilots learned through experience that steady altitude was critical. Too high and the bomb would skip over the target, too low and it might dive under the ship. Speed had to be maintained precisely because it determined skip distance. Distance from target at release determined impact point. Every variable had to be perfect, and there was no room for hesitation once the attack run began. Lieutenant John "Jock" Hennebury, one of the original skip bombing pioneers, described the technique in a post-war interview. You're flying 50 feet above the water at maximum speed, heading directly toward a ship whose every gun is firing at you. The tracers look like solid streams of light. Every instinct screams at you to pull up, to turn away, to do anything except fly straight into that firestorm. But you have to hold steady, absolutely steady, until you reach the release point. Then you pickle the bomb, count 1001, 1002 to clear the blast radius, and pull up. If you flinched, if you released early or late, if your altitude or speed was off, you missed. And you only got one pass because after the first attack they knew you were coming. The psychological demands of skip bombing were enormous. Unlike high-altitude bombing where crews faced distant flak bursts, skip bombing pilots flew into point-blank fire from every weapon the ship could bring to bear. The 30 seconds of the attack run seemed to last forever. Machine gun rounds cracked past the cockpit. 20-millimeter cannon shells exploded in the air around them. The ship grew from a distant shape to an enormous steel wall directly ahead. Yet the technique's advantages overwhelmed its demands. Once perfected, skip bombing achieved hit rates between 60 and 90%, compared to 1 to 3% for high-altitude bombing. The time over target was measured in seconds rather than minutes, reducing exposure to fire. The low altitude made fighters' interception difficult. Most importantly, the internal explosions caused by delayed fuse bombs created damage that could sink ships no external hit could match. By late 1942, the 91st Bombardment Squadron had become the 5th Air Force's specialist skip bombing unit. Their commander, Major Ed Larner, developed standardized attack profiles that became doctrine throughout the theater. Crews studied ship recognition so they could identify target types from miles away. They practiced bomb release until they could judge the perfect moment by instinct. They developed hand signals for coordinating attacks when radio silence was essential. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented the first full-scale application of these refined techniques against a major convoy. The results validated every hour of training, every modification, every calculated refinement of the method. 18 bombers had destroyed 8 transports and damaged 4 destroyers in 15 minutes. The exchange ratio was so favorable, it seemed almost fictional. Japanese intelligence initially refused to accept the battle reports. The idea that half of an entire convoy could be destroyed in a quarter hour by fewer than 20 aircraft defied everything they understood about naval warfare. Only when survivors' testimony confirmed the reports, when aerial reconnaissance showed the wreckage field, when the soldiers who should have reinforced Leh never arrived, did the full implication become clear. The Americans had weaponized physics itself. They were using the ocean's surface as a ricochet platform, transforming water into an ally that guided bombs precisely into ships' hulls. The technique required no exotic technology, no rare materials, no scientific breakthroughs. It needed only courage, skill, and precision, qualities American pilots possessed in abundance. Within weeks of the Bismarck Sea battle, skip-bombing B-25s were hunting Japanese shipping throughout the Southwest Pacific. On March 14, 1943, 8 B-25s caught the destroyer Minagumo in Huon Gulf. Approaching from multiple directions to overwhelm anti-aircraft defenses, they placed 4 bombs into the destroyer in less than 2 minutes. Minagumo sank in 8 minutes, taking her entire crew down with her. On April 7th, 12 B-25s attacked a convoy of 5 transports near WWII. All 5 transports were sunk in 18 minutes. Japanese fighter cover, arriving 15 minutes late, found only burning wreckage and survivors in the water. The fighters shot down 2 B-25s, but the exchange ratio still favored the Americans catastrophically. Throughout April and May 1943, similar attacks occurred with numbing regularity. Japanese ships attempting to reinforce or resupply New Guinea bases faced near certain destruction. Convoy operations that had been routine in 1942 became death sentences in 1943. The ocean between Rabaul and New Guinea became known among Japanese forces as the Slot of Death. The statistics told the story. Between March and June 1943, skip-bombing B-25 sank or damaged 73 Japanese ships. American losses totaled 8 B-25s destroyed by anti-aircraft fire and 5 by fighters. The exchange ratio was approximately 9 ships destroyed per aircraft lost. But statistics couldn't capture the psychological impact on Japanese forces. Soldiers knew that boarding a transport meant accepting probable death. Naval crews understood their ships couldn't defend against an attack they couldn't counter. The certainty of coming destruction created a fatalism that undermined morale throughout the Southwest Pacific garrisons. Japanese commanders attempted increasingly desperate countermeasures. They tried routing convoys along New Guinea's north coast away from Allied airfields, but skip-bombing B-25 simply staged through forward strips and found them anyway. They attempted night reinforcement runs, but Allied night fighter squadrons and radar-equipped PBY Catalinas made night movement almost as dangerous as daylight operations. Some Japanese ships were equipped with smoke generators, hoping to hide behind artificial fog during attacks. But the smoke took minutes to develop effective concealment, and skip-bombing attacks were over in seconds. The smoke did nothing except create dramatic backgrounds for combat footage. The most innovative Japanese countermeasure was the development of high-speed destroyer runs called rat runs, or Tokyo Express operations. Destroyers, with their speed and heavy armament, could make overnight round trips to forward bases, arriving after dark and departing before dawn. This technique worked in the Solomon Islands, where short distances made it practical, but between Rabaul and New Guinea, the distances were too great. Destroyers attempting the run were caught by dawn patrols and subjected to the same skip-bombing attacks that destroyed slower convoys. By June 1943, Japanese reinforcement of New Guinea had effectively ceased. The 18th Army at Leh and Salamaua, cut off from supply, began starving. Medical supplies ran out. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Food became so scarce that soldiers resorted to eating grass and tree bark. The strategic implications were profound. Without reinforcement, the 175,000 Japanese troops in New Guinea couldn't hold against Allied advances. Soldiers who had expected rotation home after 6 months remained for years, watching their units dissolve through starvation and disease. General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding Japanese forces in the Southwest Pacific, recognized the crisis. In a May 1943 directive to Tokyo, he stated bluntly, "Air superiority and enemy anti-shipping tactics have made surface reinforcement impossible. Our garrisons cannot be supplied or relieved. Unless this situation changes, we must abandon positions we cannot defend and consolidate forces where supply is possible." Tokyo's response reflected the institutional denial that characterized much of Japanese strategic planning in 1943. Imperial General Headquarters ordered Imamura to hold all positions, maintain offensive operations, and accomplish reinforcement through determination and sacrifice. These orders, divorced from tactical reality, condemned thousands of soldiers to death by starvation and disease. The contrast with Allied logistics was stark and demoralizing. While Japanese soldiers starved in New Guinea, American forces received hot meals, medical care, regular supply of ammunition, and eventual rotation home. The material superiority wasn't subtle, it was overwhelming, visible, and psychologically devastating. Japanese survivors who witnessed American supply operations after capture found their worldview shattered. Prisoners of war reported being fed better as captives than they had been as soldiers. They watched American engineers construct airfields in days that would have taken Japanese forces months. They saw supply aircraft landing continuously, disgorging materials in quantities that seemed impossible. One Japanese officer, captured at Leh in September 1943, told his interrogators, "We knew America was wealthy, but we believed our spirit would overcome their materialism. Then your airplanes destroyed our convoys using techniques we couldn't counter. Our soldiers starved while yours received ice cream. We died from malaria while yours had medicine. Spirit means nothing when you're hungry and sick and watching your comrades die from starvation." The skip bombing technique didn't just destroy our ships, it destroyed our faith that we could win. The development of skip bombing represented more than tactical innovation. It exemplified American military culture's emphasis on practical problem-solving over doctrinal rigidity. Paul Gunn was 52 years old, ancient by combat aviator standards, working outside normal military channels, modifying aircraft in field workshops. Yet his innovations became 5th Air Force standard procedure within months because they worked. This flexibility baffled Japanese officers trained in hierarchical systems where innovation traveled slowly up command chains, and changes required approval from Tokyo. American pilots and ground crews improvised continuously, sharing techniques informally, modifying equipment based on combat experience and implementing changes at squadron level without waiting for official approval. The cultural difference showed in equipment development. When B-25 crews reported that 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns sometimes jammed from firing rate or heat buildup, armorers immediately began experimenting with cooling modifications. Within weeks, they developed blast tubes that channeled prop wash across gun barrels, reducing heat and eliminating most jams. This field modification became standard installation, never officially approved but universally adopted because it solved a real problem. Japanese forces, by contrast, fought the entire war with equipment that had fundamental flaws because the bureaucratic process for implementing changes was too slow. The Zero fighters' lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, identified as critical deficiencies by 1942, was never adequately addressed. Institutional resistance to admitting design flaws, combined with bureaucratic delays in implementing changes, meant pilots continued dying from problems everyone recognized but no one could fix quickly. Skip bombing succeeded partly because it required no exotic technology or rare materials. The bombs were standard 1,000-pounders with modified fuses. The aircraft were ordinary B-25s with field-installed machine guns. The targeting system was the pilot's judgment. Any air force with medium bombers and skilled pilots could theoretically adopt the technique. But theory and practice diverged significantly. Skip bombing demanded extraordinary piloting skill, nerves that could maintain steady course into concentrated fire, and precise judgment developed through extensive practice. These qualities couldn't be taught in classroom briefings. They required hundreds of practice attacks until releasing bombs at the perfect moment became instinctive. The 5th Air Force invested heavily in this training. New crews arriving in theater spent weeks practicing skip bombing before their first combat mission. They dropped inert bombs against target ships until they could consistently hit within 10-foot circles. They practiced formation attacks, coordinating with other aircraft, approaching from multiple angles to split defenses. Only when instructors certified their proficiency were they cleared for combat operations. This training pipeline, combined with continuous tactical refinement by experienced crews, created a cadre of skip bombing specialists who could destroy defended convoys with minimal losses. By late 1943, the average 5th Air Force skip bombing crew had hit probabilities above 70% compared to 60% 6 months earlier. Experience was translating directly into lethality. Japanese forces had no effective counter to this growing expertise. They couldn't train pilots faster than Americans because they lacked fuel for training flights. They couldn't develop new tactics because their doctrine was rigid and innovation was discouraged. They couldn't modify ships because their industrial capacity was stretched to maintaining existing forces. They were locked into defensive patterns that skip bombing had rendered obsolete, unable to adapt quickly enough to survive. By August 1943, Japanese convoy operations between Rabaul and New Guinea had ceased entirely. The last attempt, a 6-ship convoy in late July, lost 4 transports and 2 destroyers to skip bombing attacks and was recalled. After that, Japanese reinforcement and supply of New Guinea depended entirely on submarines and small coastal barges operating at night, methods that could move only a fraction of required materials. The strategic victory was complete. Skip bombing had closed the sea to Japanese surface ships throughout the Southwest Pacific. 175,000 Japanese troops were effectively besieged, cut off from reinforcement and supply. The technique that had seemed like a clever tactical innovation in early 1943 had become a strategic weapon that isolated entire armies. General Douglas MacArthur, never generous with praise, acknowledged skip bombing's impact in an August 1943 message to General Kenny. "Your airmen's anti-shipping operations have accomplished what naval forces could not. Japanese sea communications are severed. Their garrisons are isolated. This achievement changes the fundamental strategic situation in our favor." Kenny, characteristically blunt, responded, "We found a way to sink ships that works. We practiced until we perfected it. Now we're doing it every day. That's not genius. That's just American engineering applied to warfare." But it was more than engineering. Skip bombing represented the synthesis of technological capability, tactical innovation, and operational flexibility that characterized American warfare at its best. When faced with an enemy they couldn't hit from altitude, American airmen got lower. When getting lower meant flying into concentrated fire, they added forward-firing guns. When forward-firing guns weren't standard equipment, they installed them in field workshops. Each problem generated a solution. Each solution was tested in practice, and successful innovations spread rapidly through informal channels. The Japanese military culture, despite its many strengths, couldn't match this adaptive flexibility. Innovation required approval from multiple levels of hierarchy. Changes to equipment or doctrine needed endorsement from bureaus in Tokyo. Field commanders had limited authority to modify standard procedures. This institutional rigidity, combined with cultural reluctance to admit mistakes or acknowledge better methods, meant Japanese forces spent the war fighting with tactics and equipment that became progressively obsolete. The human cost of this inflexibility was staggering. Between March and December 1943, approximately 37,000 Japanese soldiers were killed attempting to reach New Guinea by sea. These men didn't die in battle. They died in burning transport ships, drowning in oil-covered water, trapped in flooded holds as bombs exploded inside their ships' hulls. They died because their commanders couldn't adapt to a tactical innovation that made convoy operations suicidal. Among the survivors who eventually returned to Japan, the psychological scars ran deep. Warrant Officer Takeshi Maeda, rescued from the water after his transport was sunk in April 1943, spent 2 months recovering in Rabaul before being evacuated by submarine. His post-war testimony captured the trauma. "I served 3 years in China, fought at Guadalcanal, survived starvation at Leh. Nothing compared to those minutes in the water after our ship was hit. The explosions came from inside the hull, tearing the ship apart from within. The compartments flooded so fast there was no time to escape. I only survived because I was on deck when the attack came. 700 men were below decks. I heard their screams until the ship went under. That sound haunted my dreams for 30 years. The destroyers that survived skip-bombing attacks carried their own trauma. Unlike transport crews who rarely survived sinkings, destroyer sailors witnessed multiple attacks, saw sister ships destroyed, and understood they could be next on any mission. Petty Officer Hideo Tanaka, serving aboard the destroyer Asagumo during the Bismarck Sea Battle, described the experience. "We had fought the Americans for 16 months. We had faced their high-altitude bombers, their submarines, their surface ships. We weren't afraid because we could fight back. Then came the skip bombers. They flew so low, our guns couldn't engage them. They came so fast we couldn't maneuver. They fired so heavily we couldn't man our anti-aircraft positions. We could only watch as they destroyed ships one by one and know our turn would come. Fear like that breaks men." The broader strategic picture showed skip bombing's impact extended far beyond ship losses. With reinforcement impossible, Japanese positions throughout New Guinea became untenable. The 18th Army, which numbered 95,000 troops in early 1943, was reduced to fewer than 20,000 effective combatants by early 1944, not primarily through combat, but through starvation, disease, and isolation caused by supply failure. Medical records captured after the war revealed the horror of these besieged garrisons. At WWII, 70% of the garrison suffered from malaria by August 1943. Medicine to treat the disease couldn't reach them because transports couldn't survive the journey. At Leh, average daily ration fell to 200 calories by September 1943, less than 1/3 of subsistence level. Soldiers died of starvation-related diseases that would have been easily treatable with adequate nutrition. Skip bombing's success influenced Pacific War strategy at the highest levels. Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific Offensive, launched in November 1943 with the invasion of Tarawa, was possible partly because Japanese naval forces were tied down responding to threats in the Southwest Pacific. The combined fleet couldn't concentrate forces when every convoy required heavy escort and still suffered devastating losses. Japanese strategic planning became increasingly constrained by the reality of Allied air superiority and skip-bombing tactics. Plans that assumed reinforcement capability were revised. Offensives that required supply by sea were cancelled. The entire defensive perimeter concept collapsed because isolated garrisons couldn't be sustained. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff's planning documents from late 1943 reflect growing desperation. A November analysis stated, "American anti-shipping tactics, particularly low-altitude bombing techniques, have made surface transport impossibly dangerous. Submarine supply reaches less than 15% of requirements. Our forward garrisons face inevitable reduction through starvation, unless we regain sea control or develop effective countermeasures. Current projections suggest neither is achievable with available resources. That assessment proved accurate. Through 1944 and into 1945, skip bombing continued to devastate Japanese shipping. The technique evolved as crews gained experience and modified tactics. By 1944, skip bombing attacks routinely included rocket-armed aircraft that suppressed anti-aircraft fire, allowing bombers to attack with even greater precision. Fighter bombers armed with skip bombs extended the technique to smaller vessels and coastal targets. The final statistics of skip bombing's effectiveness in the Southwest Pacific tell a story of revolutionary tactical success. Between March 1943 and August 1945, skip bombing attacks sank or damaged approximately 450 Japanese vessels, including destroyers, transports, tankers, and cargo ships. American losses in these operations totaled 73 aircraft destroyed by enemy action, a loss-to-kill ratio of roughly 6 ships per aircraft. But numbers alone don't convey the technique's strategic impact. By making Japanese convoy operations untenable, skip bombing isolated 175,000 troops in New Guinea, forcing their eventual surrender or death. It prevented reinforcement of the Philippines, contributing to the island's liberation. It strangled Japanese oil imports from the Netherlands East Indies, accelerating Japan's industrial collapse. Most importantly, it demonstrated that tactical innovation could achieve strategic effects as decisive as any major fleet battle. Post-war interviews with Japanese military leaders consistently identified skip bombing among the most decisive Allied tactical advantages. Admiral Somu Toyoda, who became Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet in May 1944, stated in 1946, "We had no effective answer to skip bombing. Our anti-aircraft defenses were designed for high-altitude threats. The low-altitude attack profile negated our advantages in gunnery and fire control. More importantly, we lacked the industrial capacity to retrofit hundreds of ships with appropriate weapons. Even if we had developed effective countermeasures, we couldn't implement them across the fleet. The Americans innovated faster than we could adapt." General Hitoshi Imamura, who commanded Japanese forces in the Southwest Pacific through most of the skip bombing campaign, was more blunt. "Skip bombing destroyed our ability to wage offensive warfare. Without reinforcement, our garrisons became passive targets. Without supply, our soldiers starved." The technique itself was simple, but its execution required skills and resources we couldn't match. American pilots practiced for months before combat. Our pilots, by 1943, were lucky to have 20 hours training. American crews attacked in coordinated formations with fighter escort. Our ships sailed alone because we lacked escorts. The disparity wasn't just in technique, it was in the entire system that supported it. Major Paul Gunn, the 52-year-old innovator whose field modifications and tactical experiments created skip bombing, received the Distinguished Service Cross in October 1943. The citation noted his extraordinary innovation in developing tactics and techniques that revolutionized anti-shipping warfare. Characteristically, Gunn deflected credit to the pilots who risked their lives executing the attacks he had devised. In a 1945 interview, Gunn reflected, "We didn't set out to revolutionize warfare. We set out to sink ships because high-altitude bombing wasn't working. The technique emerged from trial and error, practice, and the courage of pilots willing to fly into concentrated fire to test theories. The success came from the American ability to try new ideas quickly, adopt what works, and discard what doesn't. We could experiment because General Kenny encouraged innovation. We could practice because we had fuel and bombs for training. We could refine techniques because experienced crews survived to share lessons. Those systemic advantages mattered more than any individual innovation." The legacy of skip bombing extended well beyond World War II. The technique's principles, use of terrain to enhance weapon effectiveness, precision attack from unexpected angles, suppression of defenses during attack, became foundational concepts in modern strike warfare. Modern anti-ship missiles use similar principles, approaching targets at low altitude to avoid radar detection, then striking at or below the waterline for maximum damage. For the Japanese survivors of skip bombing attacks, the experience remained traumatic for life. At the 1995 commemoration of the war's end, 52 years after the Bismarck Sea battle, surviving veterans from both sides met in Australia. The meeting produced remarkable testimony about the battle's human dimension. Noboru Okita, who had been an 18-year-old soldier aboard Kyokusei Maru, described his experience. "I was below decks when the bombs hit. The explosions seemed to come from everywhere at once. Water rushed in with tremendous force. The lights went out immediately. Men screamed in the darkness. I only survived because an explosion opened a hole in the hull near where I was standing. I was blown through the gap into the ocean. I floated in oil-covered water for hours, surrounded by bodies, wreckage, and men crying for help I couldn't give. The American planes circled overhead for hours. Some strafed the water. Many of my friends died that way. I have never forgotten their faces or their screams. For 50 years I couldn't speak about that day." Ralph Jackson, who had piloted one of the B-25s that attacked Okita's ship, heard this testimony in silence. When Okita finished, Jackson approached him quietly. "I was probably in one of the planes that attacked your ship," Jackson said. "I want you to know I'm sorry for your suffering. We were ordered to destroy your convoy, and we did. But I never forgot that we were killing men like ourselves, men who had families and dreams. The war made us enemies. Time and understanding should make us something better." The two men, enemy combatants separated by 52 years and the evolution from war to peace, shook hands. The photograph of that handshake became iconic, representing reconciliation between former enemies. But the image also captured a deeper truth about skip bombing's impact. The technique had been devastating precisely because it was personal. Unlike high-altitude bombing, where crews never saw their targets clearly, skip bombing meant flying close enough to see the ships in detail, close enough to see the men on deck, close enough to hear the explosions and witness the destruction directly. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea and the skip bombing campaign that followed established principles that remain relevant to modern warfare. Tactical innovation can overcome material disadvantages. Flexibility and willingness to experiment can defeat rigid doctrine. Training and preparation matter as much as equipment. Most importantly, the side that adapts fastest to changing conditions usually wins, regardless of initial advantages. The human cost of the Bismarck Sea battle and subsequent skip bombing campaign demands remembrance. Approximately 37,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors died in these attacks. They weren't combat deaths in traditional sense. These men died attempting to reach battle, killed during transit, drowned in oil-covered seas, trapped in sinking ships. American crews who executed these attacks deserve recognition not just for their courage, but for their skill. Flying at wave-top height into concentrated fire required extraordinary nerve. Maintaining steady course toward heavily armed ships, while tracers filled the air, demanded discipline that most people can't imagine. Doing this repeatedly, mission after mission, knowing that one error meant death, represented heroism of the highest order. The 73 American aircrew who died in skip bombing operations gave their lives perfecting and executing a technique that shortened the war. Their sacrifice, like that of their Japanese opponents, deserves remembrance and honor. The story of skip bombing, from Paul Gunn's field workshops to the devastation of the Bismarck Sea to the isolation of Japanese armies throughout the Pacific, represents warfare at its most ruthlessly effective. Tactical innovation, rigorously practiced, executed with precision, transformed adequate medium bombers into ships' worst nightmare. Physics, skill, and courage combined to create a weapon against which contemporary defenses were helpless. In the end, the revolution that skip bombing represented wasn't in the technique itself, but in what it revealed about modern warfare. Victory would belong not to the side with the bravest soldiers or most rigid discipline, but to the side that could innovate faster, adapt more readily, and implement new techniques more rapidly. The Americans could do these things. The Japanese, constrained by doctrine and culture, could not. That difference, visible in 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea on March 2nd, 1943, decided the Pacific War as surely as any fleet engagement. 18 B-25s, flying low enough to taste the salt spray, releasing bombs that skipped across the water like stones thrown by children, destroyed 8 ships and demonstrated that in modern war, adaptability matters more than tradition. Innovation outweighs doctrine, and the ability to change tactics can overcome any initial disadvantage. Commander Suguru Suzuki, who survived the sinking of Kyokusei Maru and returned to Japan in 1945, spent his final years teaching at the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force Academy. His lectures on naval tactics always included detailed analysis of the Bismarck Sea battle. He would show students the convoy formation, explain Japanese defensive doctrine, and describe how skip bombing negated every assumption on which that doctrine was based. "We were not defeated by cowardice or incompetence," he told his students. "We were defeated by innovation we couldn't counter and adaptation we couldn't match." The Americans invented a technique, perfected it through practice, and executed it with precision. They did this faster than we could respond. That speed of innovation, more than any weapon or tactic, decided the war. Remember this: in modern warfare, the side that learns and adapts fastest wins. All the courage and discipline in the world cannot overcome obsolete tactics rigidly applied. Suzuki died in 1987, 44 years after floating in the oil-covered waters of the Bismarck Sea. His final published work, an analysis of the battle, concluded, "Skip bombing ended our ability to wage offensive war in the Pacific." One technique, developed in field workshops and practiced by courageous pilots, isolated our armies and doomed our strategy. We couldn't adapt, couldn't counter, couldn't survive. The lesson for future generations is clear. Innovation and flexibility matter more than any material advantage. The Americans had both. We had neither. That difference cost us the war. The waters of the Bismarck Sea are quiet now, the wreckage long since settled on the seabed, the oil slicks dispersed by decades of current and tide. But the ghosts of 8 transport ships and thousands of soldiers remain as testament to what happens when tactical innovation meets doctrinal rigidity, when adaptability confronts inflexibility, when courage on both sides collides in 15 minutes of violence that changed the course of history. The skip bombers came in low that morning in March 1943, and nothing in the Pacific War was ever the same. 8 ships destroyed in 15 minutes, 6,900 men killed in a quarter hour, one convoy battle that ended Japan's ability to reinforce its armies. This was not warfare as anyone had imagined it. This was innovation weaponized, physics militarized, and adaptation rewarded with victory so complete the enemy never recovered. From Paul Gunn's workshops in Townsville to the burning waters of the Bismarck Sea to the eventual surrender of Japan, the story of skip bombing proves that in modern warfare, the most powerful weapon is the human ability to think, adapt, and innovate. Technology matters, courage matters, but the capacity to learn from failure and change tactics faster than the enemy can respond matters most of all. That lesson, written in burning ships and oil-covered water on March 2nd, 1943, remains as relevant today as it was when 18 B-25s changed naval warfare forever. The skip bombers are gone now, scrapped or displayed in museums, but their legacy endures in every modern military's emphasis on innovation, flexibility, and the eternal truth that victory belongs to those who adapt fastest. Commander Suzuki understood this as he floated in the water that morning, watching his ship sink surrounded by dying soldiers, listening to the distant roar of bomber engines departing. The Americans hadn't just sunk his ship. They had sunk an entire way of warfare. demonstrated the obsolescence of doctrine he had spent his career learning, and proved that innovation matters more than tradition. In 15 minutes, everything changed, and nothing would ever be the same again.